Well, it seems pretty obvious that the Ukrainian armed forces are going to lose the Battle of the Donbas. The armies, as I've said in previous videos today, it's collapsing. And, I just heard news that in Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro as it's now called, they are setting up defensive perimeters. And if you look at a map, the distance between the nearest Russian soldier and Dnipro is over 100 kilometers. Like it looks like 110 maybe. Doesn't matter. The point is that, the Donbass is lost, and the Ukrainian army is about to suffer a rout. And this is very important because what happens in such a situation, when there is a sudden collapse in a war, the political situation becomes extraordinarily fluid. All of a sudden, people who seemed very secure in their positions become very insecure. Because, of course, a failure, especially a large failure like this, turns the ground into jelly, politically speaking. And all of a sudden, people who were marginal or insignificant or seemed to have had their best days behind them, they come back to the fore. And people who seem to be in charge and seem to be running things, all of a sudden they get displaced. Now, I personally think that we are about to see a radical power struggle between Zelensky and the commander-in-chief of the army. His name always slips my mind, Valery Zaluzny. I'm just terrible with names. It's the Alzheimer's. Valery Zaluzny is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and Zelensky is the president, his boss. And I think that it is reasonable to suspect that because of the catastrophic losses, Zaluzny might be able to, and correctly, put the blame on Zelensky and his Washington minders. Because you have to keep in mind, Zelensky in Kiev, he is a puppet. And he's got a coterie of far-right goons around him. But ultimately, he's taking orders from the Pentagon, from Washington, from Foggy Bottom. Foggy Bottom is where the State Department is. The State Department and the Pentagon are micromanaging Zelensky's regime and telling him how to fight this war. And the commander-in-chief of the army, Zaluzny, he obviously disagrees with this because he's the man on the ground, and also he cares about his troops. He doesn't want to lose them. Whereas the people in Washington, they don't care. They are acceptable losses. And so I think that if there is a catastrophic loss, it could be all of a sudden that the leadership in Kiev becomes very fluid, the leadership situation, and Zaluzny takes over. That might actually be a good thing for Ukraine, because if Zaluzny takes over, he would immediately sue for peace. Because he, as a military man, understands the reality on the ground, the reality of this war. And the reality is, of course, that the Russians are winning, and there is absolutely no way for the Ukrainian armed forces to stop them or much less kick them out. It's over. It is over. And Zaluzny, as a military man who loves his country, is going to realize, as a military man, the reality on the ground. And as a man who loves his country, he will realize that the best option is to sue for peace. And Zelensky, of course, has been told by his Washington minders that he cannot sue for peace, or can sue for peace under the most absurd circumstances. Like the Russians. Zelensky said that he'll negotiate only with Putin directly, and only if Putin removes all of the Russian forces from all of Ukraine, including Crimea. Get the fuck out of here, dude. So those are absurd conditions. Zaluzny would negotiate in good faith, and he would recognize the reality. And the reality is that Ukraine has lost the east and the south of Ukraine forever. It's never going to be part of Ukraine again. Never. And he'll recognize that because he's a realistic man of the armed forces. And he was going to sue for peace because he wants to prevent the needless loss of life, because he loves his country, whereas Zelensky doesn't. Zelensky, for all intents and purposes, he's a foreigner controlled by foreign agents, foreign bureaucrats in Washington. That's what he is. So anyway, Zaluzny, if there is a catastrophic loss, he and his forces in Kiev would have to move very quickly, neutralize the goons around Zelensky, capture Zelensky, hold him in prison, and just take over the government and open negotiations with the Russians. And the Russians are going to demand their pound of flesh. They're certainly going to want Odessa and Kharkov. It's indisputable. They're going to want those two cities, and they're going to get them. There will be no negotiation, because the Russians will say, look, you either give us what we want or we keep on grinding away and take it, okay? So Zaluzny, the best thing that he can do is stage a coup d'etat, imprison Zelensky, and frankly, he'll have to shoot the others, the crazy goons around Zelensky, and sue for peace with the Russians. He'll have to give up Kharkov and give up Odessa. He'll probably be able to hold on to Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnieper as it's now called, and that would establish a new border. And the legal entity of Ukraine would be substantially reduced. Now, because of this coup d'etat, likely Poland would make the move into the West, because they would not acknowledge that Zaluzny, the head of the armed forces, is the legitimate president, new leader of Ukraine. They'd say it's undemocratic, blah, 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 Zelensky's our guy, blah, blah, blah. All this is just window dressing so that the Poles can grab a chunk of Ukraine, the chunk that they desire, that they lust over. The city of Lviv and the region of Galicia. And so that might be what happens. And what would be very interesting, as far as I'm concerned, is that, see, the regime in exile would focus around, what's the name of this gentleman here? Where did he go? Arman Avakov. Arman Avakov was the former Minister of the Interior. He was the Minister of the Interior in Ukraine from 2014 to 2015 rather, to 2021, when he was forced to resign. And this individual, Avakov, is a far-right extremist. And he is in with the Azov battalion and whatnot. And, there was infighting, and ultimately he was ejected on the orders of Washington. He was ejected, he was forced to resign, and he's sort of like vanished. He's not even believed to be in Ukraine at this time. Now, this is very interesting, because it seems to me that this man, sorry, I'm just so bad with names. They just slide right off my brain. Avakov, right? Avakov, he has strong ties with the Azov battalion leadership, with the founders of the Azov battalion and the other right-wing militias and groups and whatnot. He has strong ties with them. He is extremely influential in Ukraine. He is considered one of the most influential people in Ukraine among ethnic Ukrainians. He would probably create some sort of government in exile. Because what will happen, it seems to me, and you guys tell me if you think that this is wrong, this General Zaluzny, right, who's the commander-in-chief, he would negotiate with the Russians. He would be able to get along with the Russians because he'd be concerned about preserving the Ukrainian state in this rump form. So Zaluzny stages a coup against Zelensky. He takes over. He negotiates with the Russians. The conditions of the Russians are, we want Kharkov, we want Odessa, and we want Ukraine neutral forever. And we want it under some sort of Russian military protectorate at first, where you, General Zaluzny, will be nominally in charge and will let you seem to be the guy who's leading this rump Ukraine, but we control it. That's what the Russians would tell them. And he'd probably go along with it, because he'd realize that if he has the Russians on his side, he'll be able to reestablish some semblance of authority and control in this collapsing nation. Because you got to keep in mind, once this loss happens in the Donbas, the entire state of Ukraine will begin to disintegrate. And there will be a second mass flow of individuals out of Ukraine. Because as the Ukraine army collapses, people in the remaining civil service, the parliamentarians, the final people who are remaining in Ukraine, especially in the south and the east, they'll realize, holy cow, we didn't leave before, but we got to leave now because it's over. And so everybody who's in the east and the south, they head west. And that includes, of course, in Kiev, in the capital. They'd head west. And the whole thing would start to collapse. The whole nation would start to collapse. And so Zaluzny would need a lot of help to keep the whole thing together. You see what I'm saying? Because it would be a catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, a social collapse of a whole nation. And this country's big. It's the biggest nation in Europe. It's the size of Texas. You got to understand that a nation this big collapsing, it is a disaster on all fronts for everybody. I mean, look, the Poles and the Europeans in general, they're going to get another wave of Ukrainian migrants. It's going to be perhaps not as big as the first wave, but it's going to be a couple of million at least. I mean, you got to understand what's going on here. So the point, the Russians are going to try to help up Zaluzny to keep everything more or less functioning. And their price is going to be, you are neutral forever. You are our ally, but we call the shots in everything. In your defense policy, everything. And what they do is basically what the Russians would do is defang the Ukrainian armed force, and they'd be especially wanting to get rid of all the Nazis, which Zaluzny would also be in favor of, because he doesn't like them either, okay? And so all of those neo-Nazis, once there is a coup d'etat that overthrows the Zelensky regime, and of course, all those goons, those neo-Nazi goons around Zelensky have either fled to the west or been captured by Zaluzny's forces. Well, they would, the ones who fled, they would start to coalesce around Avakov. And they would start to coalesce and they would move into Lviv. And Lviv, I'm telling you, man, Lviv is going to be this hotbed of neo-Nazi insanity and resistance. And there will be a government in exile around Avakov, because after all, he was the former Ministry of the Interior. Mm-hmm. And Zelensky, he will be arrested or killed. And by the way, I don't think that he would be killed by, the general Zaluzny or his people. I think that his own people, Zelensky's own people, would kill him because they view him as a martyr, that he would be more valuable as a martyr than a living man. You see? I think that might happen. And if I were Zelensky, man, I'd grow eyes in the back of my head. Because, see, if there's a big loss, all of a sudden Zelensky becomes more useful dead than alive. And this is a reality, man. I mean, we're getting into... in Spanish, we called it el área chica. We're getting in close to the goal, okay, to the goalpost. This is where things get really, really ugly. And for the people around Zelensky now to kill him in order to create a martyr, I wouldn't put it past them. See, people get real ruthless when things get heavy. And a collapse in the army in the east, I must insist, it's going to be a trigger. It's going to create this incredible political earthquake in Ukraine. And we are going to see all kinds of changes. Now, what I have outlined, I could be right on the money or I could be completely wrong, but that's not the issue. The issue is we have to start thinking about what's going to happen politically after the collapse of the army in the Donbas. We have to be thinking about that because that stage is going to be exceptionally dangerous. And we're going to see all kinds of changes that we could not possibly imagine a month ago. We can't even possibly imagine them today. Things are going to move once this collapse happens. Understand what's going on.